Right, I better get this diaphragm assembled now that I've got all my blades clean. The diaphragm blades are interleaved, so you can stack up the first few blades just one on top of the other, but when you get round to blades number 4 and 5, you have to pull back the original blades because you're effectively fitting the end of the blade underneath that tip. Oops. These tweezers must have something on them, make them sticky. That's the 5 blades in place. You can see bugger all of that. Sorry about that. It's the 5 blades in place. Got the moving plate that rotates those. As that rotates, it swings the blades in and out. That's seated over the top of those pivots. One there is not playing the game. That's better. And get the case in position. There's a little post on that plate that sticks up and fits into a matching hole in the case, so the plate will only go on in one position. It's not abundantly clear to me why they felt the need to do that, because obviously making the hole and drilling and fitting a little rivet is 2 extra operations they probably could have done without. Just fit the 3 screws in the retainer plate. I'm not doing them up tight yet. I want to check that that moves freely. It does. That's good. I can tighten those 3 screws up. You can probably see the marks on that plate. Here in particular, and to a lesser extent up here, they're fingerprints. That's where someone stuck their finger on there at some stage, and just the perspiration, skin oils and so forth have just etched into that coated surface. Anyway, that's that part done. I need to do the mechanism plate next. Well, I've got the mechanism plate cleaned and back together here. Basically, I just removed the 3 screws, took these components apart, cleaned it carefully to get rid of all the oil that was contaminating it, put it back together, and I've lubricated that lightly with some graphite powder, so that's moving nice and freely, no problem at all. Now I've got to just put my blades back on. The blades I've cleaned. Now the blades go on in the blades open position, so I've got the blade actuating ring around in the blades open position. And they always start at this point. The blades are assembled anti-clockwise. These blades are lightly marked, not sufficient that I would bother to polish them. Had the marking had been a bit more obvious than that, I probably would have polished them with some Brasso, So there's all my blades in position, and now I can put the case on there. If I get this correctly aligned, to put my case on over the top and put my case screws in. There's 3 small screws. I do them up very lightly indeed because I don't want to risk damaging the shutter blades should one have moved while I was putting the case over the top of the mechanism plate. Right, so let's check. And the blade actuating ring, yes, that moves those blades. They swing in and out freely, so I can tighten up the 3 screws. And that's all the blades back in, mechanism plate clean, and I just need to reassemble the components on the top of the mechanism plate. Well, with the mechanism plate basically back, or the base part of the mechanism plate all in place, I can put all the other components in. So I've got to start with the springs. There are 2 fine springs that I'll need to get into position. And this one in particular is very good at trying to get away, so I've got to hold down in the centre with a toothpick so that it hasn't got the opportunity to escape. Lift up the tail of it and swing it behind that post. So that lever and this lever are now sprung loaded. That's nasty weather. Right, the second spring goes here, and this is the spring, return spring for the B lever. I need to open up the blades so that the B lever can drop it down into position on the blade actuating ring, so it makes it easier to put the lever in position. Here's the B lever. And that is held in place with a spring and screw here, which is a little bit awkward to get into position. It's a very dark and dismal day today, but the camera here seems to be picking this up okay. Swing the tail of that spring around. It drops down against the lens tube in the middle. If I hold the B lever back with my finger, I can pull the blade actuating ring back into the blade's closed position. Now a little bit of molybdenum paste on the end of a toothpick. And this spring here, this detent, I need to put some there, and on that post and on that post, those 2 posts connect up with the main drive cam. This little detent is important. That tends to keep the blades in the open or the closed position, not flopping around in between. That part's fine. I think we can put these components back on now. So first I'll clean those with some naphtha and a cotton bud. Well, I was just looking at this. This is the setting lever for the self timer or the flash sync, and you can see that that's got quite a pronounced bend on it. means that somebody was pulling and tugging on that lever in an attempt to get the shutter to do something it didn't want to do. So I'll just pull that square. That should be fine. Now molybdenum paste again. 2 spots. One on that lever, on those little ratchet teeth there. And secondly, in the case, there's a little detent spring there for the position of the lever, and I want to get that in there. Now I've got to get the pin behind that fine spring so it's on the right side of it. Doesn't want to drop in. Let's pull that spring back a bit. That's better. That lever's in position. That seems to move fine. This shim only goes on in one position. And the aperture setting lever goes on here. And that's held in place with 3 small screws. Do those screws up very lightly until you've got the whole 3 of them in position. They're quite fine. It's fairly easy to cross thread screws like that, so be cautious when you're doing them up. That one doesn't want to start. That's better. Do up the 3 screws. Check the action of the aperture setting lever. That's very, very tight. That suggests to me that that lever is probably bent in some fashion and is rubbing. I think it's pressing on the case at this point. I'm just going to lever that up slightly, see if that makes a difference. Well, that's a lot better. It gets bent if somebody has pulled or pushed on that lever there where you would change the EV value. And if somebody's been particularly rough with that, it'll bend it, which means that this thing is then not sitting flat, it's buckled, and so we'll have tight spots. A tight spot right there. Now there's probably only one of those 3 screws that is pushing against the tight spot, and I've got to work out which one it is, because most likely it's not all of them. I want this to move very freely because otherwise there's a danger that the aperture setting and the shutter speed settings will be able to come apart. Unexpectedly, I mean, not when you expect them to. See if I can work out which one of these screws is bearing on that plate. It's definitely that position. So it means that this plate is bent here somewhere. It's got a high spot. So when it comes against the screw, that's a high spot. So if I lift either side of that, it should bend that high spot down. Well, it's improving, but it's not as much as I'd hoped. Check that that's my problem. It certainly is, because as soon as I tighten that screw, that's where the problem shows. It's at this end of the action that it tends to be a problem. That's pretty good now. Alright, I'll check each of the 3 screws in turn, slacken them slightly, and check to see if there's any difference in the way this thing works. That had made no difference at all. This one then. No, I can't say that made a difference. So the difference is here, and it'll be because that lever's been abused. Someone's pulled or pushed on it too hard. And the difference, the fault will be quite subtle. It'll mean that that ring is not dead flat. But trying to pick that it's not dead flat just looking at it is often very, very difficult. I think that's as good as I'm going to get that. I'm going to lubricate that slightly with a bit of graphite powder, just where those 3 screw heads are, and work that in. And usually that's enough to make all the difference in the world. That seems to be fine. I'll just go and blow that graphite powder off. Yeah, that's working great now. That's absolutely nice and free. That means so that when this is clipped to the shutter speed settings, it won't be dislodged accidentally. So far, so good. So all our flash sync mechanism here, I'll get out the components for that and clean them. Start with the pallet wheel, drop that into position, and then the little sector arm that drives the pallet wheel. I'll put a touch of molybdenum paste on the very tip of that where it latches. Drop that into position on its post. That latches behind that lever, so that lever there is where it would latch. Now I've got to put my spring across here. It's busy trying to get away, as springs always do. So I'll just get this in my, held firmly in my pliers, and stretch that across from that post to that little hole in the arm, like that. So when you cock the shutter, this part is cocked and it drops behind that latch, and as soon as the shutter starts to fire, it releases, driving that pallet wheel, which in turn would drive the flash sink basically. Right, I'll get some more of these parts cleaned, ready to go. Alright, get these components in. This piece is always tricky to get in because the spring on the tail of it has to press in against the case. If it sits at an odd angle, it'll actually block the mechanism. And it's doing exactly its best to do that just at the moment. Let's see if I can remove that and have a look at the position of that spring. That spring there is pointing downhill too much. It means it's been bent at some stage. Let's see if I can square it up a little bit. That's it. I don't want to bend it up too much, otherwise it'll be a problem in the other direction. Get this in position again. That's better. It's not uncommon to find minor problems like that. Generally they're the result of abuse of some sort, either intentionally with someone doing a repair and attempting to adjust things, and in adjusting the wrong thing, probably adjusting the wrong component when they're trying to make some adjustment. Or they may be accidental damage where somebody's just been a little bit clumsy. Some of them may be an original fault right from the time the shutter was first manufactured. Some minor faults won't show up at all in terms of problems with performance, or may only show up occasionally. And in cases like that, there's no reason for the fault to be picked up during quality control checks. That seems good. It works nicely. The molybdenum paste again on this latch here. This latch holds back the main drive cam, which is just about our next component in. I think I'll put the shutter release lever in first. I'll just clean that. There's usually not much to the shutter release lever. Doesn't usually require much unless it's been bent. Sometimes things do get bent accidentally or on purpose. Make sure the tail of the spring's tucked in. That's good. So when that's cocked, this would be holding back the main drive cam. When you press the release, it would lift this lever, releasing the main drive cam here and allowing the main drive cam to rotate. And as it rotates, it would open the blades and close them again. Right, so far so good. Main drive cam. Here's the main drive cam. I'm just running some molybdenum paste around that curved edge at the top there, and at that edge and that edge where it's going to pick up the studs on the blade actuating ring. I just put a smear on the inside too, just for good measure. Here's the main drive spring. The main drive spring in this case is a little bit tired. They are virtually all a little bit tired. Once upon a time they would have been replaced as a matter of course when doing a CLA, primarily because the springs are effectively overstressed. The design pushes the springs beyond the point that springs would normally want to be pushed if you expect them to remain within spec for any length of time. Right, that all looks good. So now I want my retard gear train and my self timer or delay action timer back in place. Now I've cleaned these in the ultrasonic cleaner in some solvent. I'm just going to lubricate these with a bit of graphite powder and I'll pop them in.